Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Pagashnik. Thank you so much for listening. And on the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs around the internet, including Cover 32, Cold Omaha, and Zone Coverage, and numerous podcasts on the internet as well. He is Arif Hassan. Arif, how are you doing this day?
Doing well. How are you?
You know, it's comically windy outside. Comically windy. I have watched from my window as all of the residents of this particular apartment building attempt to come in from the parking lot, and it looks like one of those old-timey movies where, like, the mime is struggling. Like
your umbrella's like flipping inside out.
Oh yeah, like one of these kids is going to blow away, and if it was my kid, it would be tragic. But if it's somebody else's, it'd be hilarious. So like I'm sitting and watch like because like it's like 30 to 40 to 50 mile an hour gusts, and so like people are like struggling, and so it's like wow, this is amazing. I'm going to flip this chicken on the grill now and just kind of watch this thing go down. Just get a nice little spot on the porch and just watch this go down and enjoy the fact that I'm enclosed and the wind isn't actually going to cause my grill to start any sort of fire. So, welcome to our special draft coverage, our post-draft episode. We have 8 picks to go over, and then we have all sorts of free agents who apparently saved the draft, according to some, and some rookies to discuss as well. So we have plenty of stuff to talk about here. But before we begin, just want to thank you guys so much for listening and for sending out links to the show and helping promote the show for us. If you enjoy the show, if you hear value in what we're presenting to you, you can donate to the show in one of 2 different ways. You can go to paypal.me/Norse Code and send a tree fitty that way. Again, we appreciate it. You can also go to patreon.com/Norse Code, and that's much more of a subscription basis. You can give $1 a month. You can give untold amounts of money a month, whatever you feel comfortable with. But again, it helps keep the lights on, keeps the Loch Ness Monster at bay, helps us buy things that we need for studio space, things like that. So again, thank you guys so much. We really do appreciate it. Anything that you're willing to throw our way, we certainly help. We like being ad-free, and you guys like us being ad-free and helping have the content and the quality of the audio sound so high. So again, thank you guys so much. Now let's go on to the show. And the first pick of the Vikings 2018 draft was a cornerback named Mike Hughes.
Yeah, the name almost sounds like a prank, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like every time we read it, it feels like this isn't the correct name.
Yeah, right. I feel like I'm being trolled by saying it out loud. But yeah, no, I mean, so I saw, heading up to the draft, I saw a couple of mock drafts, I think about 10%. Obviously, Chris, the Daily Norseman, has the mock draft database, so he actually knows what the actual percentages are. But somewhere in 10 to 15% at some point. Gave the Vikings a cornerback, and I was like, well, that's ridiculous. Why would they do that? Like, obviously, that's like one of their needs, but it's like lower on their need priority list. And, it's such a sweet spot for offensive linemen that even from like a BPA standpoint, I don't think that makes a ton of sense. So I actually dismissed those mocks. I think I even wrote a piece because I did some mock draft roundups before the DN database kind of got going. And then I just kind of let it go and let them handle it. And I was kind of dismissive of these mocks that had some of them had Mike Hughes, some of them had Isaiah Oliver. And I was just kind of dismissive. I was like, well, I don't really see that happening. But OK, it's good to have like variety in mock drafts, I guess. And then it happened. Right. And I was just like, oh, well, OK. And the thing about this is Hughes is a pretty good player and he's got potential to be the best cornerback in the class. Obviously, the better opportunities for that, both from a talent and like playtime perspective, given the Vikings depth chart, are for like Denzel Ward, and the Packers is Jair Alexander, and the Packers is Joshua Jackson. It depends on sort of what's happening with Isaiah Oliver and why he fell. But, those are the guys that were generally rated above him or rated around where he was. And many of them have better opportunities to get on the field. So, off the bat, even if he's maybe the better player, he's not going to get a ton of opportunity to play. And the odds are that he's not necessarily a better player than those guys. That's like fine, I think, abstractly for a first round pick, especially you're picking like 30. You don't like get to choose the best player at a position. But I think what gets a lot of people upset And the reason I think that this wasn't great, and then as the draft kind of played out, because one of the things I said at the end of the day was, well, if the draft plays out in a particular way, it's not going to be that big a deal, is that it became really difficult for the Vikings to address, which is like very clearly their highest priority need. As a player, Hughes has a great production profile. I mentioned in my analytics piece on him, and I've only published like 2 of the analytics pieces because I just kind of got swamped. More will come a little bit later, maybe by the time this is recorded. But as I mentioned in the analytics piece of him, he's got the best production profile of any cornerback in the draft that also played a full season. Alexander played 6 games. And so he has a better profile for the 6 games that he played in. But overall, when you look at, the adjusted yards per snap and coverage allowed, you take a look at, the ability to get your hand on the ball, ball hawk rate, which is what that's called, on targets, the completion rate that you give up, that sort of stuff. His is the best in the class. 0.22, I think, adjusted yards per snap and coverage. Whereas I think the average corner allows basically 1. He didn't allow a touchdown last year. He hasn't lost a game since like his freshman year of college, which I found that out during the presser. I was like, what? That's nuts. But yeah, not only did the national championship Central Florida Knights go undefeated, but his community college went undefeated as well. So that's cool. He's a good player, and he's certainly a first-round quality player. It's not as if my criticism of this pick is the same as my criticism of the Trey Waynes pick a couple of years ago, where I thought the Vikings picked the right position, but either picked the wrong player or picked a player at the wrong value. This is kind of the opposite of that, where I think they picked the right player, and we could, his off field is pretty concerning, but in terms of talent, picked the right player, but I don't think they picked the right position. But, for the most part, he's as a player, you talk about him instead of the pick. You see a guy who can mirror footwork really well, who's very agile, who's pretty instinctive. He's really great in man coverage. He needs to work a little bit on zone coverage, which is, kind of surprising. In the presser, they asked him, hey, you played quarterback in high school. Does that help you when you play cornerback? And he's like, yeah, it lets me figure out what the quarterback is going to do. You think that translates to zone coverage stuff, but that's, whatever. And in zone, he needs to work on his awareness a little more. And so if the Vikings are going to play him in the slot, that's going to be really important, his ability to not just read the receiver that he's playing, which you often do on the outside and man, but to kind of read the entire offense to see what your responsibilities are, which is why the slot cornerback position, Zimmer's mentioned a couple of times, it might be more difficult actually than the outside cornerback position to learn. Like you might not be going up as against as many good receivers, although that's less and less true as time goes on. But the position itself is very difficult to learn. And that's why Wayne started out in OTAs in the slot to give him a big plate so he can learn more about the defense overall. But Hughes has a history of picking things up insanely quickly. So obviously he's played in 3 different defenses and it's 3 different years in college. 1 year at North Carolina before he transferred to a JUCO. Showed up to the JUCO basically right away and then just started for their defense. Sam Ekstrom has a really great piece on that over at zonecoverage.com. Talked to his college coach, and I think he talked to his high school coach too. Really good stuff. But then he showed up 2 weeks before the season started at Central Florida and became a starter right away in his only season there and picked up the defense pretty quickly. So I think that's really good evidence that he can pick things up quickly, and if the thing that you're concerned about is awareness, it's probably not going to be a concern, I think, long term. That'll allow the Vikings to have a really good competition at the slot cornerback spot. I think it also kind of frees up Mackenzie Alexander to maybe compete on the outside more, where he's probably better. Who knows? But it's a good pick. It's going to be a player that helps the team, or a good player that they picked, a player that helps the team. But it creates the scenario that we ended up seeing play out, where the Vikings kind of miss on an interior offensive lineman. And it really sounded like they cared a lot about that. They mentioned it multiple times in their pressers. Jamal Stevenson and Rick Spielman, I think it was mentioned 3 times in the different pressers that they had, that the interior offensive line run that occurred at the top of the second round was really stunning. And so it's clear that they cared about that, right? Because they didn't talk about how the quarterback run was amazing. It's 5 quarterbacks drafted for the first time since I think 99 or something like that. They didn't talk about the wide receiver run that occurred like in the third round or something like that. They talked about the interior offensive line run. They clearly paid attention to that. And I think they wanted an interior lineman, and they couldn't get good value for that at 60, nor do they have the trade value to trade up for it, which is kind of a knock-on effect of the Sam Bradford trade, because they didn't have that fourth, and that's kind of what they would use. Otherwise, they'd have to like trade a future third or something like that, which, I mean, they never trade future picks. So, that's I should say they never trade future picks during the draft. They clearly traded a future pick for Sam Bradford.
Right.
But yeah, so that's kind of the issue that they had. And, I've been thinking about this. So the question is, should the Vikings have traded down? Should they have picked a player at that spot, an interior offensive lineman? Should they trade down to try and get more value? Because, Austin Corbett went like 2-1, right? Like he went right at the top of the second round. And then there's that run. So, I mean, how far down can you legitimately trade? And I don't remember what the Ravens pick in the second round was, but that is probably your best trade down target, because that's actually what the Ravens did. They traded up into 32. And so if you could get what the Ravens gave up, and the Ravens get to move up 2 more slots than the actual amount that they traded up for, probably you should take that. He said, so Spielman said he had gotten a couple of calls 5 picks before his pick showed up, and then those calls dried up by the time they got to pick 30. And that is, I'm sympathetic to that. You can only trade down when like there's 2 people that are willing to. But then, you see the Ravens trade up and you think, did you just miss an opportunity? Were the Ravens not interested at 30, but were interested at 32? Why is that? If you just offered them the compensation that it takes to trade up to 32, would they have taken it? And, probably. And it's kind of incumbent upon him to kind of realize that and be proactive in trades if you don't think the value is there, not just be reactive to trade offers coming to you. And I'm sure he like called out and stuff like that, but I think the thing about not having trade offers is not necessarily false, but I think kind of a little bit misleading, because we did see a team trade up, and even if you took a discount to trade down, you would have got more value. You would have been able to get an interior offensive lineman. And I think that kind of would have resolved a lot of concerns. Now you have to wait on a corner, but we saw how deep that cornerback class was. Really good corners were going in the third round. So I think in this case, Spielman misplayed the draft, which is pretty unusual because he's normally extremely good at playing the draft landscape and figuring out, like in the presser he mentioned hotspots, figuring out where the hotspots are going to be and figuring things out. But I mean, they seem blindsided by the interior offensive line run, which I don't want to be like there's no excuse for that, but I think there's no excuse for that. Like I think if all of these like fun fake mock simulators that like Fanspeak and the first pick, so there's two simulators out there. I tend to pimp the Fanspeak one because I have my board on it, but so Fanspeak's on the clock. And the other one is just first pick, which is I think first-pick.com. Every time, so when I put my consensus board up there, which historically has been one of the best boards at predicting the draft, every time I put my consensus board up there, someone would tweet back at me. I got like 18 tweets or something like that, a lot of tweets back about people who were like, yeah, I tried to get value by picking like, a defensive tackle. Usually it was a defensive tackle, not always a cornerback, but a defensive tackle or a defensive end or a cornerback or whatever. And then all the offensive linemen were gone by the time we picked in the second round. This makes me worried. And it was like, well, if the machine got it right, like you should. It's a fun draft game that doesn't really need to be all that accurate for it to work out. Why is it right and not you? Not that this is like a fireable offense or anything like that. It's just like you misplayed it. You should have seen it coming. The simulator saw it coming, so it should have been on your radar that this was certainly likely or possible. And the Vikings seem absolutely blindsided by it. And he even said this is the strongest interior line class we've seen in a long, long time. And so I don't know why you wouldn't expect a run to occur then pretty early. So that results in the Vikings getting a tackle instead of a guard, which is fine because you can move Mike Rummers to guard, which I've been against for a while. But given the landscape of how they could pick, that seems to be the optimal move now that they could only get a tackle as opposed to a guard. Whereas before the draft, if you could choose between a tackle and a guard, I would have chosen a guard. But that's fine. So they're at 62 and they pick a tackle, Brian O'Neill. Luke and I were talking about O'Neill a lot before the draft. He's been mocked to the Vikings a couple of times in the first round. Before the Senior Bowl, he got first round hype. I think he was listed in either Kuiper or Mayock's or McShay's top 15 players. And the thing about him is he's a super athletic, raw offensive lineman from Pitt. Who's only played on the offensive line for 3 years after switching positions. I don't know if that reminds you of anyone, James, but
I refuse to know.
Yeah, right. People got upset because it's got kind of the same shades of it, but I don't really care about that. I don't think first of all, a lot of it kind of relies on the school connection, and I just absolutely do not care about the Jets got another USC QB. Who cares, man?
Yeah,
is the QB good? It's the same thing.
The connection of school to NFL team sometimes is so played up. Even if they've changed coaches 3 times in the last whatever, some people, Vikings and Florida State. That's the Vikings just end up picking anybody who's of any decency of Florida State, or just or the Jets to USC. It's but no, it's just doesn't need to be that played up,
right.
But let's talk just a little bit about Hughes for a moment and his style of play, because a lot of people are taking this as proof that Trey Waynes is on the hot seat as a result of this pick. How do you feel on that, and where would Hughes be most effective?
Yeah, and this also speaks to, the argument that, the cornerback is actually a larger need than you're giving them credit for, which right. I'm, sympathetic with. I don't think this puts Waynes on the hot seat, especially after he had such a great second half of the season. It just gives them more cornerbacks. I think sometimes you have to read between the lines in pressers, and sometimes you can kind of take them at their word, and it's difficult to navigate that. In this case, I'm kind of choosing to take them at their word that this is, if it does put anyone on the hot seat, it's Mackenzie Alexander. So that part, I'm not taking them on their word. I do think that this was a kind of reaction to Mac not developing quite the way they wanted to. But hey, he's entering his third year. Waynes kind of blew up his third year, so who knows? But yeah, I think this is more about Mackenzie than it is about Waynes. But it does kind of, the Vikings have until Wednesday to figure out if they want to tag Waynes with a 5th-year option. They didn't, Thomason asked at the presser, are you going to, activate the 5th-year option? And they said they haven't decided that yet. It'd be a pretty expensive one too, because cornerbacks get paid a lot. And so, you've got Waynes obviously for next year, and then you can have Waynes for the year after that if you've got the 5th-year option. And if he, keeps playing super well, you can tag him, right? Which is actually not that much more than the 5th-year option, honestly. Unless, somebody gets signed to a mega deal in 2019, which is certainly possible. But, for the most part, yeah, you can control him for 3 more years, right? So I don't think it puts him on the hot seat, but it does give you insurance if he falls back off, if last year was a bit of an anomaly for him. And, that's nice. I don't know if I typically draft insurance in the first round. Again, it's late in the first round, so your options are a little bit more limited. But my argument against the Andrew Billings pick a while back when Vikings wanted him in the first round, which, it just was flabbergasting to me. I just didn't understand it. And he went in the 4th round. But although I think for medical reasons, it wasn't I was proven right about this thing. But the argument was that he would be insurance for Linval Joseph. And I think that's just a catastrophically poor way to figure out your first round pick when you do have significant and obvious needs. If you're a more complete team, if I guess the Eagles, then yeah, just do whatever you want. But I think if you got like some pretty significant serious holes, yeah. And some people are saying cornerback is definitely a hole. Look at what happened in the playoff game, and it's like that's one game. And Mackenzie Alexander actually got better throughout the year. He gave up like it was like over the course of 3 snaps in that game that kind of just broke everything down. And so I think that's also a dumb way of looking at your needs, is to look at one game. But yeah, I think that it does give you insurance. There is a function here that's being fulfilled that addresses the kind of the team need dynamic. But I don't think that that's kind of enough to justify a first round pick still. And I don't think it puts Waynes on the hot seat. And you can control Waynes for obviously all of 2018 and for 2019 if you want. And so it didn't strike me as a particularly significant need. Still a need, obviously, right? Because I had cornerbacks mocked to the Vikings in the 3rd round multiple times, usually like MJ Stewart or Duke Dawson or something. But yeah, it's it addresses a need, but a smaller need.
So we could go quite a bit longer on Mike Hughes, but do we have any final thoughts on kind of where this puts the Vikings as far as, like, should we have done literally anything else?
I mean, not literally anything else. I mean, there's like
not letting the clock go down to 0, obviously.
Right. I mean, there was a couple of picks that the Vikings could have made that are in the realm of possibility that I probably would not have liked, but yeah, this is just kind of, it's underwhelming. I think pretty significantly underwhelming. I don't think it's like it's not like an F or anything. It's not like they drafted Colton Miller pick 15 or anything.
Well, no, it's just watching the, and we had mentioned this briefly before the show about how Vikings Twitter is just this like awful sea of salt, just viciously salty. I don't know anybody who really like loved this draft, but there seemed to be an abnormal number of people who absolutely hated it.
Yeah. Okay. So that's we should talk about this. Vikings Twitter, Vikings Reddit, a lot of Vikings comment threads have been just like really just toxic. And it's just like people are just like blowing up and getting angry. And I get it. This is a really underwhelming draft, but like, I think also we've been treated to just
excellence.
Yeah, exactly. I think between 2014 and 2016, on the day of the draft, or the day of day 3 of the draft, people have been remarkably satisfied with what the Vikings do, and it reflects on the consensus board too. Actually, the consensus board has given the Vikings a top 3 grade for every single year that the consensus board has been out: 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017. So 4 consecutive years of drafts that are well regarded by draft experts. They typically provide us a conduit to fan reactions, right? Because they're the ones that kind of frame them a lot of the time. And they've done that, right? Anthony Barr, Teddy Bridgewater. How could you be like upset at that? Laquan Treadwell. Like, I was not in love with the pick, but I understood it. I liked it kind of. I'm not going to say I liked it, but I understood it. And then Mackenzie Alexander.
You're not going to be on tape defending the pick of Laquan Treadwell.
I mean, there was video of me talking about the pick, being like, yeah, I guess. So, there's that. But I mean, like, yeah, and then you get Mackenzie Alexander and was that the draft where I don't know, people were pretty excited about the draft. It was not a great draft in hindsight, obviously, but like, I think at the time people were like, yeah, they got the receiver, big body receiver. They got a steal in round 2. I like what they did in like round 3, round 4 sort of stuff. And, Bucky Hodges got people excited. And I think legitimately so. I loved that pick. Obviously it didn't work out. But yeah, so, it was like a draft, people be excited about it. And so this is underwhelming draft. The consensus board says it's about average, a little bit below average. And all the people that help kind of frame people's responses, which include me, were underwhelmed by the picks early on, and then the picks later on didn't continue to drive excitement. And so I think after experiencing so many positive feelings after every single draft, it's easy to take a below average draft and treat it like it's a Seahawks draft or something. They've been the worst drafters over the past 5 years, the consensus. It's not close.
Can we just have a nice moment of silence for Russell Wilson in the 2018-2019 season?
Oh, rip. No, he's got a running back to take the pressure off him, right? So he's fine.
They won't be able to pass the ball. They won't be able to screen. They won't be able to drop back. But by God, that man is going to live in shotgun.
Yeah, right. Jesus Christ.
There is nothing there. So
Powerful.
Let's move on.
Well, I mean, at least they've gone away from drafting bad offensive linemen to just not drafting offensive linemen.
We just sucked so badly at it that we're just going to stick to free agents. And even then, we're just going to take walk-ons from camp. So can you stand? Are you 6'6" or taller? All right, good. We can make this work. Pete Carroll can teach you. Let's go to Brian O'Neill. He is pick 62 overall, offensive tackle out of Pittsburgh. So we get an offensive tackle, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe he's we picked up a guard too. But that's it for offensive linemen this draft.
Yeah, it is. And I don't think they picked up any in undrafted free agency. Not that would have soothed the balm of the burn of not having offensive linemen. Great, you got Brett Toth from Army who can't even play for 2 years and then is a developmental tackle after that. Okay. If they'd only come away from the draft with 2 offensive linemen, abstractly I would have been fine with it. The manner in which that occurred, I'm not. But the problem is that they're both, fairly developmental. In one case, that's fine. He's a 6th or 7th round pick, right? 6th pick, I think. And in the other case, that's a little bit alarming in Brian O'Neill, just because it's fine to get developmental players, right? You need to lay down the foundation for the long term. And if you've got kind of a long-term plan and all that, that's fine. I often use the phrase, you need to have a plan in place for when you draft a particular player. And I don't think that's always true for a developmental player. Sometimes it's just the plan is to develop them and not play them right away. But for some players, you need to figure out sort of what circumstances they should play if they end up playing, kind of what the training regimen is, kind of how you're going to tailor your offense around them. I typically mean this about, quarterbacks, wide receivers. And I wouldn't say you need to have a plan in place for Brian O'Neill, but you do need to have a plan for the scenario in which you have to come away from day 2 with only 1 tackle, and it's a developmental tackle like Brian O'Neill. And I'm not sure that the Vikings do have a plan, right? Because he's not going to be able to play right away necessarily unless he picks up the offense really quickly and he takes to the technique like a duck to water, which would be great, but fairly unexpected even based off of the comments they gave at their own presser. So that would be a pleasant surprise. But for now, we don't have a solution at tackle. Presumably if we're moving Remmers to guard. If we don't have a solution at right guard. And honestly, I don't love the solution at left guard either. I came into the draft thinking that the Vikings have 2 offensive line needs, not 1. And then so in the first round, they draft a cornerback, right? But O'Neill is a fine pick. Luke and I talked about O'Neill before the draft. I mentioned this. And we watched him at the Senior Bowl. And at the Senior Bowl, he was remarkably underwhelming. In fact, I think so I was really disappointed. I think he had a bunch of hype. I was excited to watch him. And then at the Senior Bowl, I was like, this dude is just bad. What's happening? And then Pro Football Focus came out later and said, yeah, he had the worst one-on-ones of every tackle. I'm just are you kidding me? He was bad. Why is he a first-round pick? And so Luke and I have been trashing him for a while because we saw him be bad in person, and that always leaves kind of more of a memory. But I've been watching a little bit more of him before the draft. I watched a little bit more of him because it's on the radar, and his tape on film was a lot better than what he put at the Senior Bowl, which is good because he didn't go up against terrible competition. He went up against North Carolina State. They had all 4 linemen drafted, right? So, and one of them at 7 or something. So, he did fine, which is good. People are really propping up his game against Bradley Chubb. I see people share it on Reddit and on Twitter. or people saying, hey, check out his game against Bradley Chubb. And like, I don't know why that's like a hype thing. Like, it's good to be informed as a fan, but like, I don't know why that would get you hyped up because, first of all, in the very first play, he just gets destroyed, which just kind of leaves a bad taste in your mouth. But, you know, let's say you just delete that from the record and you just take a look at the rest of it. A lot of it's like very unconventional stuff, like cut blocks, for example, to keep Chubb contained. And so, you know, that's not stuff that I think like A, is indicative of his technique so much as it is a really smart game plan by Pitt. But B, I mean, he does get, he oversets a lot. He does get kind of out of position, and that's like fine. Bradley Chubb is amazing, right? But like, it's not something where I'm like, yeah, this is the guy that's gonna like replace Jason Peters and Tyron Smith as like the best left tackles in the NFL or anything like that. So he'll take a while. I like him as a second round pick is the thing. And so my dislike of Brian O'Neill was really just about the conversation surrounding him as a first round pick. As a second round pick, I get it abstractly, but there's not really a solution for a team who we admit is in the middle of a Super Bowl window. Everybody likes to extend windows. Only one team has been able to really have a perpetual Super Bowl window. That's the Patriots. You'll go mad trying to replicate what they do. Every other team has had like windows open and close. And so if the Vikings are in a window, odds are more likely than not that at some point that window will close more than it will like stay open. And obviously have plans to keep it open for as long as you can. But in that case, I don't like the idea of sacrificing a lot of your short-term opportunities to really win in order to kind of sustain that long-term foundation, especially because that long-term foundation can be maintained with moves in the medium term. Like, I mean, they can draft a cornerback either in the second or third round or like next year, right? Like, it's not that big a deal. You've got like lead time on this cornerback thing, whereas you don't have lead time on this guard or this tackle thing. And then you end up getting a guard or a tackle that is, you just have to wait. So that's my problem. I like Brian O'Neill as a prospect if you pay the appropriate price for him. And I think in a vacuum, the Vikings did. But I think that in terms of what it means, it's not great, especially because the way that people have been talking about Kirk Cousins, me and national analysts and, you know, a lot of Vikings analysts I trust, like, you know, Matthew Collar, for example, he needs to have a good supporting cast, and the Vikings very nearly have the kind of supporting cast that would make Kirk Cousins look like he did in 2016, where he was like the third most efficient quarterback in the NFL. It was phenomenal. The receivers are a big part of that. He's got Dalvin Cook with him, which is great. You know, Kyle Rudolph's a functional tight end. You know, the Vikings got, you know, another tight end, I guess, and that should help. But a big part of Kirk Cousins' success in Washington was that tremendous offensive line that has like 3 Pro Bowlers on it and 2 really good other players. And when that line got injured, he got worse. When he didn't have it in 2015, he looked worse. And one of the things that people pointed out is that under pressure, he's been a significantly worse quarterback. He throws a ton of interceptions. He's turnover prone. He, you know, creates a lot of fumbles under pressure too. And under pressure, he's just not as good. He needs to have, you know, things kind of go on rhythm and things kind of just go according to plan. And the Vikings have a very inconsistent young group in, you know, Pat Elflein and Nick Easton, and a inconsistent veteran group in like Riley Reif and Mike Remmers, right? Because Reif and Remmers, when they're good, are like really good. Like they're like top 7 or something at their position when they're good. And when they're bad, they're just like, I mean, like, they're not Eric Flowers or TJ Clemmings, but they're like not fun to have. But like, you know, they're bad when they're bad, right? And they're more volatile than most offensive linemen. And so, yeah, that's a worry that you have, because the Vikings have turned the worst offensive line in the NFL to one that on average is average, but can have some really bad games and some really good games. And you just want to create more consistency so that passing environment is kind of worth the $84 million investment. And I don't think the Vikings did that, especially because, like, yeah, one of the reasons the defense is so good is because they've sunk so many resources into it. But also, like, it's really good. Like, do something with the offense now, because you yourself said that the offense was unsustainably good last year. Like, Mike Zimmer was talking about, like, horseshoes, right? Like, you know, it's unsustainably good. Make it sustainably good. And, you know, I don't think they did that.
So let's move on to the next pick, which was in round 4. Pick number 2, Jalen Holmes, defensive end from The Ohio State University.
I didn't love this pick. I don't hate it. This is kind of how I feel about a lot of these picks, right? Didn't love it, didn't hate it.
Now we get to reach the point of, we'll see.
So Holmes is a position convert. He's and appropriately so. He should not be playing, I think, defensive end. I don't think he's got the athletic profile for it. He ran like a 7.63 3 cone at 280 pounds. That's awful for a defensive end. But as a defensive tackle, I mean, that's not great. And 3 technique tackles typically win through agility over explosion. He's got great explosion numbers, really poor agility numbers. But, there are some 3 technique defensive tackles that do win via explosion. So we'll see. He's a defensive end, defensive tackle, kind of hybrid, kind of like BJ DeBose, kind of like how they turned Scott Crichton late, kind of like Christian Ballard to go pre-Zimmer, I guess, and to choose a successful Zimmer defensive end, defensive tackle hybrid, because those names probably don't inspire confidence. You can take a look at Wallace Gilberry. For the Bengals, who was pretty good. He ended up starting at defensive end for a while, starting at defensive tackle for a while. Only when Geno Atkins was injured, but he was a pretty good sub package rusher. And he gives the Vikings depth, which is all they need at the moment at 3 technique. It kind of depends on what you think about like Jaleel Johnson and where he should play and stuff like that. His athletic profile is not astounding. His production profile is not astounding. They like the way that he can move, it's not like he's not like below average at anything. So like that, it doesn't bother me as a particular pick. But I thought there were better picks to make. Maybe you're just too scared off by the Maurice Hurst thing. Totally get it if his heart is like whatever. But there are other like 3 technique tackles you could have taken. So, okay.
So the next one is attempting to address our tight end situation, and Tyler Conklin out of Central Michigan was picked up.
I didn't end up actually doing a lot of work on Conklin. It's a pretty weak tight end class, and so if the Vikings weren't going to come away with Ian Thomas, and Luke Inman has been just adamant about getting a really good tight end. So he was like, let's get Mike Gesicki round 1. I'm just like, Luke, that's a terrible idea. Let's get Dallas Goedert round 1. Maybe you could get him in round 2. And she's like, you were just obsessed with this tight end thing. Mark Andrews in round 3. Like, he's been talking about it a lot. And I just kind of didn't care. So I watched, Andrews and Hurst and Gesicki and Goddard, and I liked them as athletes on the field. But I didn't end up watching a bunch of Tyler Conklin. I have ended up watching him after the Vikings have drafted him, and I understand the pick. He's got great footwork. Just I think kind of generally. He does a really good job, obviously, with the ball in the air. That's like kind of the thing that people will talk about with basketball players. And he's got that thing, too, where he's pretty good in the air. And I think he's a solid receiving option who's like decently athletic and super explosive vertically, which I think he ended up having like a 38-inch vertical, too. So that kind of fits. I don't know that he'll be kind of a between the 20s guy. I think he's got the potential to be, I think, more than Rudolph does at the moment. And so you probably have more functional tight end capacity if he does turn out well and he does develop well, because then you could start using your tight ends, I think, in a more productive sense between the 20s. But I think once you get to the red zone, having both him and Rudolph is pretty great. It's a good pick. Solid.
So the one that got the most attention outside of Mike Hughes was the selection of a kicker, Daniel Carlson. In a weird pick that we both traded to the Jets and then reacquired from the Jets. So Daniel Carlson was picked up. Kai Forbath was reached for comment, to which he hung up the phone. There's been some mention about how Daniel Carlson hasn't missed an extra point in however long, and it is worth pointing out that he was kicking from the 2 and not kicking from where, Yeah. So Daniel Carlson picking up a kicker in the 5th round. That seems interesting. It's another pick I don't hate.
But it's also a pick I don't love. And I think that there were better opportunities at that pick slot. Plus, I would have rather had those 2 draft picks than the 1 in order to pick the kicker. I don't think kickers are so invaluable that you shouldn't draft them. But I think that, we do a really poor job of evaluating kickers. I think they're abstractly worth draft picks. But I think there's pretty good evidence that like undrafted kickers have done better in the league than drafted kickers. And you have to take into account, like, we know what the sample size is for drafted kickers. We don't know what the sample size is for undrafted kickers, but it's larger. Obviously, it has to be much larger. Yeah, it's like, it's whatever. Like, people are like, absolutely, you need to do it. Kickers are so valuable in the league. You know, they score points, which, like, I know that they score points.
I feel like the same people that are saying that should be playing our league. Like, they should be playing the Norse Code league.
Right, yeah. Kickers are insanely valuable, especially when the rules require that they be valuable. But it's a great pick. You know, kickers are a necessity, and it's like, I agree, because if you don't have a kicker, you can't score points. But like, the Vikings have a kicker, like, and he's fine. Like, he's not amazing or anything like that. But the marginal improvement from like an average kicker to a very good kicker is not enormous, especially because you tend to take more risks the better kicker you have. So you tend to take more kicks from, 50 plus yards, and they'll miss those kicks. I mean, you're not going to get Blair Walsh 10 for 10 fresh, his rookie year, 50 plus yards. And so you're going to give up a lot of yards, right? And generally speaking, it's still like worth it. But like, yeah, so the Vikings punted a lot, when they were in, their opponents like plus 40, right? And that's not great. And that's a product of Kai Forbath having a weak leg. The Vikings would probably kick field goals with a kicker with the kind of leg that Carlson has. That's true. They also, and it would be a net positive, but it's not as positive as I think a lot of people think, because those aren't made kicks. You end up essentially punting the ball to their 40 when you miss. And so the point differential is just not that large, and kickers just don't have as big an impact on games as people think they do, especially because people are like, well, you need a kicker to like make those clutch field goals at the end of the game. And it's like, kickers are largely not that different from each other when you get to those clutch situations, unless it's like Adam Vinatieri or Stephen Gostkowski.
But at that point, it really turns into more of a question of whether or not like the coach has confidence in the kicker, or like the abstract concept of kicker confidence itself too. So was it really necessary? I'm not entirely sure, but it did seem odd that of all places that we're going to end up picking a kicker, you end up kicking it fairly early, or picking it fairly early.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I'd rather have the second best kicker in the draft plus another player, honestly, which is what it looked like it would have been, especially because I think there's a lot of disagreement over like who the best kicker is. Like Daniel Carlson, huge leg. I think SEC points leader, set a bunch of SEC records and stuff like that. Dropped off his senior year for whatever reason. 4 for 8 from 50 plus. Maybe you can fix the stuff that's bad and only keep the stuff that's good. That's kind of the thing about kicking, is that special teams coaching in college is not like spectacular, right? So you've got someone with a lot of the natural potential, maybe that's good. But, the second best kicker might have been like Eddie Pinheiro from Florida State, I think, or Florida. And he, I think he went undrafted, right? Another kicker went drafted after him. Our ability to evaluate kickers is so poor, and our ability to like determine like the difference between sort of the value difference between the best and second best kicker in a draft is also poor. So I don't know why you give up picks to select him. So I didn't think it was smart. I didn't think it was, sort of value positive. I think there were other positions and players that you could have picked or addressed there. And you could have gotten another player. But like, I get it, I guess.
Do you think it's more of a situation of just how on edge every Vikings fan and presumably every Vikings coach and player feels when Kai Forbath lines up for an extra point? Or do you feel like there's something else going on?
I think a lot of it has to do with the extra points thing.
Yeah. There is a nervousness after the Vikings score a touchdown that really shouldn't be there. But it is a nervousness that happens every time. Every time he lines up back there. I'm still not 100% convinced. And I've said this before, but I'm not 100% convinced if Diggs found a way out to the sidelines, if he ended up doing that instead of pulling off the Minneapolis Miracle, I'm not convinced that Forbath hits that kick.
Yeah.
And it's hard to argue a hypothetical like that, because there's a real possibility that he wouldn't. And even though he'd played fairly well earlier in the game, but still had that missed kick. So it's hard. And Forbath hasn't had the best record with the Vikings, as we've shown with the absolute nervousness when it comes to extra points. But I didn't like the pick just because of where he ended up getting selected. But the rest of the draft is as follows. Colby Gossett, guard from Appalachian State. That was 6th round. A few picks after that was Ade Aruna, defensive end from Tulane. And the final pick, which just went all over the board from New York Jets to the Vikings, then the Jets, we ended up picking up Devontae Downs, linebacker from California, Berkeley. Any final thoughts on the last 3 picks?
Yeah, and super quick, I like the Colby Gossett pick. I think he was underdrafted, which is great. That means it's good value there. He has an opportunity to actually play earlier than Brian O'Neill does, and I don't think that's an indict of Brian O'Neill. Maybe an indict of like the pick strategy surrounding it. We already talked about that. But he's developmental in the same way that a lot of late round offensive linemen are. But there's a lot there I think to work with. I like it. Ade Aruna, I'm not sure about it. I tend to just prefer pass rushers with bend, and he doesn't have a ton of it. But Spielman was right that from a production standpoint, if you take a look at not last year but the year before, he was really productive. Last year he got put into a different system that didn't suit him, kind of like that guy from Villanova that the Chiefs ended up drafting, Tano Capasno. So same sort of thing, really long. I think the oldest prospect the Vikings have drafted, and really explosive. Be interesting to see where he goes. For now, I would say Tayshaun Bauer and the undrafted free agent, and the other 6th round pick, Stephen Weatherly, both have better shots at doing better than he does. But it's fine to take a shot at a late round defensive lineman. They tend to get athletic ones a lot. And we had Jordan Reed on last week we asked him about a defensive lineman they could pick up late, and this is the guy that he isolated. So that's kind of cool. And the last pick. I wanted to say Hercules Madafa, but I forgot who it was. Was it? Yeah, Devontae Downs. So he didn't actually end up playing very much. He got injured in 2017. 2016, he didn't have a ton of snaps against the run. But he's a bigger guy, 250 pounds, pretty athletic, but not as athletic as like the guys they typically get in the late round. They tend to get guys that run like a 4.68 or faster in the late rounds. People like Brandon Watts, who ran a 4.41, or the Newberry guy, Edmund Robinson, who ran, I think, like a 4.48 or something like that. They tend to get really fast late round linebackers. Elijah Lee, really good example. And he was projected to run between a 4.78 and a 4.82. Who knows? But at 250 pounds, it's a little bit better than a 220 pound guy, running at that speed. So you kind of get it. He doesn't hit as hard as he should. And we don't have really good evidence for what his instincts are against the run, but he should be decent in coverage, and he's pretty solid downhill. So downhill is a runner, like he's got good downhill speed. But it's kind of a flyer. I don't expect him to do better than Elijah Lee. But it's a late round pick, so it's fine. You get an injured player, that happens a lot.
Yeah, these things happen. Let's go to a brief discussion on our undrafted free agents. We have quite a bit to talk about here. We picked up a wide receiver, running back, defensive lineman, linebacker, wide receiver, cornerback, tight end, safety, defensive tackle, and safety. You'll notice that there are no offensive linemen in there.
Right, yeah, which, whatever. Who's the last undrafted offensive lineman the Vikings had that have... Oh, it's the starting right tackle.
Yeah, him.
But yeah, it's not that big a deal. You don't expect a ton of return on offensive linemen. I honestly love this undrafted free agency class, to the extent that one can love an undrafted free agency class.
It's really, at this point, we're just looking at who is going to end up making your big book before training camp.
Right, yeah. But this is probably the strongest class of UDFAs the Vikings have ever had going in. I mean, obviously, any class with Adam Thielen in it does all right for itself. But going in, I would say that this is the strongest class. I don't recall a class having more than 3 players in the top 300 of the consensus board. And there's a player in the top 100, a player in the top 120, a player in the top 200. By the way, these are different players I'm mentioning. So, so a third player is in the top 200, 4 more players that are in the top 300, another player that's in the top 400, and 3 more players that are in the top 500, which is just incredible, I think. So Holton Hill, cornerback, Texas, off-field concerns, got suspended from the team. The suspension, it's rumored, would have carried into the next year. So we need to know what that is before we can kind of evaluate kind of what the off-field risk is on our end. Obviously, the Vikings know on their end. The whole NFL knows because he was a top 100 talent on the consensus board, but he goes undrafted, probably not for injury reasons. And so it sounds like whatever it is a super risky thing to deal with. But if he keeps his head on straight and I don't know, doesn't commit any crimes or do drugs and gets caught by the end, I have no idea what the suspension is. It sounds like he'll be a pretty phenomenal ad. Then you've got Hercules Madafa, who's really difficult to figure out. He played defensive tackle at 250 pounds. Well, 245 pounds. He gained weight for the combine, so he's 253 at the combine. A 245-pound defensive tackle will not play defensive tackle in the NFL. That's why he goes undrafted. We don't know what his position will be. There have been people that have talked about him as a middle linebacker, like a defensive tackle to middle linebacker. That sounds super weird. Although, in fairness, Bruce Irvin went from nose tackle to outside linebacker for a while, and then he went back to pass rusher. But that's just so weird. But that's a thing to think about. Some people want him on the edge. He doesn't quite have edge testing numbers that make you think, this is kind of like a diamond in the rough. But he was just so productive and so athletic that it makes sense that he was worth a shot. And honestly, if a long snapper is going to get drafted, I mean, they should draft. He should have been drafted. It was a weak class. And so for him to go undrafted was really surprising to me, even though there's a lot of positional convert concerns. And whereas Jalen Holmes, who's going to convert positions, has the athletic profile, Madafa might not. So I kind of get it. Corey Robertson, super productive receiver at Southern Miss. Jake Weineke, super productive receiver at South Dakota State. A lot of people like him a lot. Corey Robertson ends up getting a higher grade in the consensus board. Trey Matthews, safety from Auburn. I don't know a ton about him. He's supposed to be pretty good. Obviously, he's a top 300 pick. Rock Thomas, running back, Jacksonville State, was a 5-star recruit, the number 1 recruit coming out of high school. And he's got really good sort of Jacksonville State film, highlights, I should say, because that's all I've watched. But he's got really good highlights. They're fun to watch. Garrett Dooley, an edge or linebacker from Wisconsin, depending what the coaches want to do with him. I thought he was pretty draftable based off of what I saw, and he was at the Senior Bowl. So really good stuff. Cameron Petway, running back. Mike Boone, running back. Jeff Badett. I think his name is pronounced Badett. Wide receiver / kick returner. Boone and Badett are really good athletes. Petway should be pretty good just in general. There should be some exciting stuff, and I wouldn't be surprised if more than the usual number of undrafted free agents, which I think is like 3, more than the usual number of undrafted free agents make the team, despite how stacked the team is from a depth perspective. I think, every year we're like, Marcus Sherrills is going to be gone. No, he's a cockroach. He's going to stay. No, he's going to be gone. No, he's a cockroach. He's going to stay.
Well, he is both the most underrated and overrated player on special teams every year.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
As we determined at the beginning of the year.
This is the year, he says, without knowing, knowing that everyone's been wrong. But this is the year that Marcus Sherrills is really on a roster squeeze. Because there's finally somebody who can actually return punts, not just kicks, in both Mike Hughes and Jeff Badett. And it's just an exciting cornerback group. Mike Hughes, obviously, but Holton Hill is there. And it's not like, some of the guys that are currently on the roster, like Horace Richardson, don't have a shot either. But it's going to be tough. Really tough. I think tougher than it's been in a long time for Marcus Sherrills. So, that's all interesting. I don't know anything about Curtis Cothran, Tyler Hops, or Monty Foreman, Jonathan Wayne, Trevon Mathis, or Christopher Gonzalez, but they are undrafted free agents, so they will be written up eventually.
Eventually, you will have all sorts of things to say about them.
Yeah.
All sorts of blurbs. So before we move off to the mailbag, we can take a look just at our do we know anything about the rookies invited, including the defensive back out of Minnesota?
I don't know how the name doesn't sound familiar. Minnesota defensive back Kunle Allende. I don't.
We can cut this part too if you want.
No, this is a joke about Yinka.
I fucked it up. Apologies. 3, 2, 1. So before we go off to the mailbag, we've got some rookies that we can just mention quick, including the defensive back out of Minnesota. Do we know anything about this group?
The name's not familiar. Kunle Allende. No, it's not ringing a bell, man.
That last name doesn't do anything for you?
Nope. I know. So this is actually really cool. So invited to Vikings minicamp. Kunle Allende, who's the younger brother of Vikings blogger, who we've had on the show, I think. And if not, he's been on.
We should probably fix that if he hasn't been.
Yeah, right. Exactly. He's been on the Football Machine. Yinka Allende from climbingthepocket.com and the Daily Norseman. Super cool. Hopefully, obviously, it works out. Minnesota dudes who've walked into camp without a contract have a good history in Minnesota, so that's kind of cool. So we'll see how he does. I heard he's got other invites, maybe. Maybe I heard wrong. Yinka obviously would know, and I wouldn't. But that's cool. I hope he sticks somewhere. Also, there was like one. Oh yeah. Mackenzie Alexander's brother got an invite too, which is kind of cool too. So we always like those connections. We'll see.
So let's go to the mailbag. Plenty of mailbag questions here, including from Scott Burkett, who asks, is this year's draft part of a trend where Rick does better at the top of the draft versus the bottom? Or do you think this is a one-off issue where he misjudged the O-line demand?
No, I think he misjudged the O-line demand. And I don't think it makes sense for him to have done that because it's pretty predictable.
Next question is from Ryan, who asks, it's hard to feel like this draft addressed any immediate needs outside of corner depth and possibly tight end. Are there any available free agents that the Vikes could look at in the coming weeks?
Joe Berger?
I think I saw a picture on Twitter of him.
Oh yeah, Spielman pasted over John Cusack's character.
Yeah, from Say Anything with the boombox, presumably playing In Your Eyes. Yes.
Yeah, phenomenal. Now I got Phil Collins stuck in my head.
Which is funny because it wasn't a Phil Collins song either.
Really?
No, In Your Eyes isn't Phil Collins.
Who's that?
Oh, God damn it. I know it's not Phil Collins. In Your
Peter Gabriel,
Eyes.
right?
Peter Gabriel, yes.
Yeah, sorry, whatever. 80s power ballads, or not power ballads, ballads. Same thing.
Later, we're going to have a discussion on Lady in Red, and it's just going to be awful.
I can't think of any free agents off the top of my head. They're still thinking about Terrence Newman, but I think they're thinking probably no at this point. That's at cornerback. At offensive line, I have no idea. So we'll see.
Yeah. Next question is going to be from Joe Schneider, who asks, as of right now, what would you predict the starting O-line to be?
That's interesting. So obviously, Riley Reiff on the outside, Pat Elflein on the inside. I think without a guard, Nick Easton on the left side. On the right side, you're choosing between Brian O'Neill, Colby Gossett, Mike Remmers, Rashad Hill, and I think at the moment they don't want to start Brian O'Neill. So I'm going to go with this is tough. Oh, and I guess Danny Isadora you're thinking about too. Maybe this is Isadora's year. It's kind of wide open for him. That's okay. Mike Remmers at guard and Rashad Hill at tackle. Yeah.
Matt Murphy asks, do you think the Vikings could have gotten the exact same draft class without making any trades at all? Did they gain anything by their trades?
I'd have to look at the trades more in depth, but I would argue no.
I'm just going to take a shot in the dark here. No. Doug Nasby, what players from the 53-man roster last year are going to feel the heat after our draft selections and the UDFAs?
That's super interesting. So, not to like predict which players, right, will get cut, but the players that will be feeling pressure obviously include, I think, Marcus Sherrills, which I mentioned. At 3 technique, probably Dylan Bradley, who I think was on the 53-man. If he wasn't, he was on the practice squad. And a little bit Jaleel Johnson. There's pressure. I don't think he's going to lose his spot or anything like that. And then there's not going to be much safety pressure. Obviously Kai Forbath, who, okay, so I want to bring this up. So, when the Vikings drafted a punter, Jeff Locke, they mentioned that there'd be competition at the position. And then 2 weeks later, they cut, Chris Kluwe before, I think, OTAs or something like that. And, Kluwe was like some competition, right? But the Vikings argument was the competition doesn't have to occur live. And so they just had this kid punt for a while and decided, yeah, it's good enough. And
I like the idea of them having like both Madden and like the NCAA like college football game going. And like,
yeah, right. That's the competition.
Yeah, they're just working. Yeah, the special team coach is just Prefer, I believe, is just is just coffin kicking, just running through drills of that, and whoever ends up getting like the better one, just doing the exact same thing.
We better coffin corner score.
Yeah, we've got the projector going. We've got like the room going. Nope, I didn't like how he looked on Madden this year. let's just see if we can trade him over to let's see if he can have some more luck over in, let's say, Seattle or Oakland.
Right. Yeah. But yeah, I think I wouldn't be surprised to see Kai Forbath cut, despite what they said about preaching competition, just because, again, the competition doesn't have to occur live.
And isn't his contract not guaranteed as well? Not
guaranteed at all. $700,000, something like that. So it's not difficult to let it go. If it was guaranteed, it wouldn't have mattered. It's only $700,000. But yeah, I think they will end up having the competition be live, because for kickers, you just want them to deal with like the NFL timing, with the potential of like NFL level players blocking and coming off the edge, and having NFL pressure. So I think the competition will be live, unlike the punting sort of quote unquote competition. But yeah, so the pressure is going to be on. There's not a ton, right? Normally there's like, I think after a draft class, you can identify a bunch of pressure points. This year, not a ton. I guess Colby Gossett's going to push Danny Isidora and Tom Compton, who was not on the 53 last year. Brian O'Neill is going to push, I think, long-term Mike Remmers, but this year I don't think he has to worry that much. Tyler Conklin obviously is going to be pushing Blake Bell. Jalen Holmes obviously going to be pushing Dylan Bradley / Jaleel Johnson. Ade Aruna, yeah, he's gonna put pressure on Ifedi Odenigbo and to Sean Bauer and Stephen Weatherly. I'm not confident that he'll successfully be able to do that, but that's kind of worth mentioning. And so that's, I think that's where we're at.
Luke Braun asks, is it okay to feel like the UDFAs saved the draft?
No, probably would have gotten the same UDFAs. I would count the UDFAs, which again, maybe the strongest UDFAs we've ever had. Well, at least since we can recall. It's not like we're like, yeah, Arif, what about the John Randall UDFA class? I don't know, man. Sorry. But in a while. But I think you probably would have gotten them either way. You could have just had a good draft instead. No, but if you want to evaluate it as kind of like one group and you just substituted the UDFAs in for some of the draft picks that you didn't like, and you're like, hey, Daniel Carlson, let's treat him as a UDFA. Holton Hill, 5th round draft pick they traded up for. Wow, I'm super excited by that. That's really cool. Or like Devontae Downs, kind of unexciting. Oh, Terhilkis Matafa. Oh, great, fantastic. That's a great pick. In that sense, sure, but like I don't think. I think the huge missed opportunities in the 1st and 2nd round still overwhelm things.
Next question is from David, who asks, would you ever trade up for a punter?
Yeah, I think punters are more important than a lot of people. I mean, they don't score points, but yeah, I would. I think the difference is, it would have to be like a Michael Dixon level, which I guess the Seahawks did trade up for Michael Dixon. But you'd have to be like really upset with your punting situation. They'd have to be like Jeff Locke level bad. And I don't know that John Ryan was. If he was, I don't really hate that selection from the Seahawks as much as a lot of people do. I think punters are super valuable. I think they give your defense like potentially 10 yards, like more than a bad punter. So if you can get 10 more yards after every drive than you normally would have, like, Jesus. So, yeah, I would. But only for really good punters. Michael Dixon's supposed to be really phenomenal.
Yeah. Adam Barrett asks, have our NFC North rivals, let's just go with NFC North for the moment, closed the gap while we've stood still? The Bears had a very good draft.
They have begun to close the gap, for sure. I think the Bears had a phenomenal draft, yeah. The consensus board draft grade that I put out, that I've been arguing about on Twitter while we've been recording, is not happy with the Bears. I personally think the Bears did a great job, like Roquan Smith and Anthony Miller, and there's like a third pick that I thought was really solid that's in the top 60, the consensus board. Really solid stuff, and they're surrounding Mitch Trubisky, who I don't think will be able to take advantage of it. But they're really surrounding Mitch Trubisky with a lot of really solid top-tier talent. So, yeah, they're closing the gap. I think the Lions had a good draft. Well, they made some bad picks. Like, I think the Kerryon Johnson pick wasn't great value. But the offensive line picks, I think, were really, really good, and they needed them. So like Frank Ragnow, and they got another guy that I'm pretty excited by. So the Lions had a pretty good draft, and then the Packers had just a phenomenal draft. Fuck them.
So let's talk about the Packers draft for just a moment. I realize they drafted a whole mess of cornerbacks, but
the whole mess.
Yeah, the whole mess of them. Was this due to our wide receiving core, or is it because they didn't have any cornerbacks?
I think they had some talent there, but it made sense to just add talent. And I think that, so I think it's like not like the Viking situation where it's like, Mackenzie Alexander, Nichols are starters. You got to upgrade there. I think there's like potential, right? But I think that their upgrades were just so dramatic that it makes a lot of sense. The cornerbacks they're driving, maybe the top two cornerbacks. I mean, like, obviously Denzel Ward's very good, but I think Josh Jackson could be in the conversation depending on how you view him and how you use him in the NFL. But two of the top two of the top four, still just really phenomenal picks. And Jair seems like a perfect Mike Pettin cornerback. Josh Jackson's just like good, even though he doesn't really do what Mike Pettin does. Yeah, good stuff.
The Minneapolis North Star asks, why did they pick Brian O'Neill over Orlando Brown?
Orlando Brown does not meet their athletic thresholds remotely at all. Even if you throw out the fact that he had like the worst combine in history at his position, and history here refers to the last 15 years because you don't have more than 15 years of combine data. But I guess we do have like something close to 20 years in some databases, and it's the worst in that one too. So yeah, even if you throw that out and you just take a look at his pro day numbers, also bad, like really bad. And the Vikings definitely care about that. And they even mentioned in the presser, they care about that. At some point, a player becomes so good, and if they fall far enough, you end up taking them, that your athletic thresholds don't matter, which I think is kind of a thing with like Dalvin Cook. Like if he had been there and they had a mid-first round pick, they might have passed on him because of that. But in the second round, like it'd be stupid, and they got him. So at some point, it stops mattering. It downgrades a player pretty significantly on their board. Yeah. He doesn't fit schematically what they want to do, and that's kind of built off of those athletic requirements. Now, I think that as a third-round pick, he was a good third-round pick for the Ravens. I think they were right to do it, and not just because it's a super cool story. They got drafted by the team that had his dad, which I think that's dope. As a third-round pick, that's smart. The second round, no. It's not good value in the second round. It doesn't fit what the Vikings want to do. He looked pretty good on the field, so yeah, that's fair. But he just doesn't move as well as the Vikings need him to for what they do schematically.
Kyle Slaby asks, which of the day 3 picks has the best chance to significantly impact 2018?
Colby Gossett, right? Like, because I think he's got a path to starting, even though he's developmental. I guess besides Daniel Carlson, because like he's going to be the kicker.
Yeah.
Colby Gossett's got a quick avenue. Jalen Holmes is obviously he's going to be behind Sheldon Richardson. We don't even know if he's going to be active on game day because we saw what happened with Jaleel, who wasn't active on game day for a long time. The special teams linebacker, I think, is probably not as good as the other special teams linebackers the Vikings have gotten over the past couple of years. And even if he was, he'd be a special teams linebacker. And Ade Aruna is up against just a really friggin' talented group of depth defensive ends. So it's going to be difficult for him. But Colby Gossett's got sort of just like a straight line into potentially starting.
Also from Kyle Slaby, how will history remember John Gruden's current stint in Oakland? Totally out of touch or secret genius?
Totally out of touch. The fact that they got Maurice Hurst, one of the interesting things about grading the draft board is that the Oakland Raiders ended up with like an average grade, but they made the most catastrophic mistakes on day 1 and 2 and ended up making the best picks on day 3. So it's just like weird, right? PJ Hall is a second-round pick. This is a guy that I was excited by, that I was like really like, he's probably a fifth-round pick, but if the Vikings pick him in the 4th, I'm still going to be excited. That's really cool. And they got him in the 2nd. That's dumb as hell. Colton Miller, terrible pick. Just awful. I don't think he's a first-round quality guy. Like, I think Brian O'Neill is a better tackle than him. He's obviously not as athletic, but no one is. Colton Miller is like one of the most athletic guys we've seen come through the combine, and that includes Lane Johnson. I would have drafted him below Brian O'Neill, who is just better on the field. It's a terrible pick. So, yeah, and they made a lot of mistakes in free agency too. I don't know. I mean, like, I think it's fitting that it's the Raiders that took the biggest risk on Maurice Hurst. Mm-hmm. And it makes me think that given the short track record we have of the Gruden era Raiders and how many bad decisions they've made, to me, it just makes me worry about Maurice Hurst's heart more, that they were the team that decided, okay.
That's horrible.
But I mean, like, you get it, right? It's like, the team that has a history of making bad decisions, or the team that are comfortable with his health. Yeah. Like, but it is horrible. I
just want the Oakland Raiders GM. I think that's Reggie McKenzie to be charged with something if something happens to his art.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Oh, that's terrible. Next question is going to be from Alex Goebel, who asks, what does Jalen Holmes' selection mean for Tashawn Bauer and Stephen Weatherly? Has the bar been significantly raised for them to make the 53?
No, because he'll end up playing a different position than he did in college, and so he will not be playing the Tashawn Bauer, Stephen Weatherly position. He'll be playing the Jaleel Johnson, Tom Johnson. Tom Johnson's no longer here, but the Jaleel Johnson, Tom Johnson position of the 3 technique, which they needed another body. So it does put pressure on Jaleel, but not a ton, and I don't think it puts any pressure on Bauer or Weatherly.
Raul asks, flashback to 2015. You are GM Rick Spielman and you want a corner. This time you're drafting with perfect foresight. Marcus Peters becomes an immediate Pro Bowler, but due to the off-the-field concerns, you have to trade him before his rookie contract ends. Trey Waynes requires some patience, but he becomes a solid starter who ultimately plays 10 years for your franchise. Who do you choose and why?
What did Marcus Peters end up getting traded for? A 2nd-round pick, a 4th-round pick, and a 6th-round pick. Holy shit.
Yeah.
I would. Marcus Peters. You don't have to worry about what happened in the friggin' NFC Championship game, right?
No.
So you're probably in the Super Bowl. Yeah, Marcus Peters. And then you end up getting a 2nd, a 4th, and a 6th. That's great. Then you draft Mike Hughes, right? Which that makes tons of sense now. Yeah. Then you draft Mike Hughes, and then you've got 2 seconds, right? And you use one of them on Connor Williams and use the other one on Brian O'Neill, and now we're super happy.
Yeah, it works. Yeah. Final question is from Matt Freeze. Sure, Matt Freeze. How many football-related Excel or equivalent spreadsheets does Arif have on his computer?
So I screenshotted how many I had open at the moment and sent that to him. It's a lot. Some of the documents are unnamed and unsaved, which it really bothers me. But which I guess I'll end up fixing. How many I have on my computer? Like over 1,000, probably. It's a lot.
How many of these are related to gambling or gambling-related scenarios?
They're all related to statistical analysis of football, which may or may not end up being used for gambling. It helps that Vegas gives you a reasonable approximation to evaluate team win totals and team performance. So, who knows, James?
That might be my best. That might be my favorite response in 4.5 years of this podcast. There is absolutely no gambling going on behind these walls. Absolutely none. What we have is analysis going on, and it just so happens that some of this information. Excellent. So that is going to be it for this episode. We hope you've enjoyed it. Arif, what do you have to plug? You from the articles that have been posted to your Twitter trolls, it looks like you've been busy.
Yeah, I've written a lot for zonecoverage.com. I've got a lot more to write. A ton of analytical breakdowns on all the players the Vikings drafted, except for the kicker. I don't know how to do analytics on kickers. So he kicked a lot and scored points. And maybe he's super athletic. Who knows? But yeah, I've got that. I've got all the consensus. I've got the consensus board grades. I've got how did your team do in the draft? I'm currently editing the consensus board article because I screwed up somewhere. But tons of stuff. Head over to zonecoverage.com. Some of it's behind a paywall, and it's $3 a month. It really supports my work. It helps me a lot. And if you subscribe at zonecoverage.com, you will also get access to the training camp guide, as well as all the draft coverage we put together. We've got videos that Luke have put together. We've got great write-ups from Sam. I mentioned a really great story about my cues from Sam. There's also, I think, a story on Brian O'Neill about why he switched from tight end. That's pretty cool, too. So, there's tons of stuff. Too many articles to list.
Too many articles. So that is going to be it for this episode. If you've enjoyed the show, you can go to patreon.com/Norse Code or to paypal.me/Norse Code and donate to the show. Throw us $3.50, kind of help keep the Loch Ness Monster at bay, help keep the lights on. So that is going to be it for the show. For Arif, my name is James. Thank you guys so much for listening, and continue to demand excellence. Demand Norse Code. And we'll see you soon. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and co-host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at Norse Code DN. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/Norse Code, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/Norse Code. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can also be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.